Welcome to the Kitchen Table, a show dedicated to helping you escape diet culture, gain trust with food, honor your body, and live a brighter life. Hello. Welcome back to the Kitchen Table. I am so glad you're here. I'm your host, Alicia Brown, an anti-diet registered dietitian nutritionist. And today, oh my goodness, I am so excited. I've got Melissa Parks from @MelissaParksSays on Instagram. That's where I found her. And I have been on her content for months. I was just sharing with her before we started. I'm like, I send my husband everything you post. She posts about relationship mojo. She talks about the window of tolerance, as we've talked about here on the show, as it relates to our nervous system and how we regulate that. However, this is something that we need to talk more about so we can build our window of tolerance to be more resilient and to also act more in alignment with who we really are and how we really want to show up in the world beyond all of our food and body stuff that sometimes can get in the way. So yes, we're talking with Melissa Parks. You can follow her at MelissaParksSays on Instagram. And while you have your phone out, make sure to subscribe to the show as well. Cool. Melissa, thank you so much for being here.
I'm honored. It's such a pleasure, and I'm really excited.
I am too. I've been so excited. Can you start kicking us off with how you got to where you are today as a therapist and coach?
Yes. So I often say that I think that people tend to pursue therapy or psychotherapy for one of two reasons. I'm sure it's more than that, but I tend to think that it's either in your blood. So like somebody in your family is a therapist, or somebody that that's close, is in the field. And so you kind of enter it that way. Or the second way is you have some healing to do, or you have something that some kind of self-understanding that you're trying to accomplish, some self-awareness. And that was me. And so, that's what sort of landed me going towards this path. And of course, I'd like to say that it was all my decision, but there's that spiritual component too. I think that this path kind of chose me in a sense as well. But so that was me. And I started very young and continued. Like I never switched careers or anything. This has just been my passion right from the get-go. So yeah.
Fantastic. And that shows through your content as well, that you're just passionate about helping people connect with themselves.
Thank you.
And you say on your Instagram that you help people reach and heal in relationships and befriend their nervous system. Talk about the nervous system is something that I talk a little bit about with my clients, the fight or flight response, or the kind of hyper-aroused detachment response. And this can be our, ways of reacting to situations rather than responding. We talk about that in relevance to the window of tolerance. For everyone listening, if you go back into earlier episodes, I have an episode on the window of tolerance. If you want to, listen to that episode, it's a great one. But can you kind of elaborate more on the effects that like food and body stuff, worries, anxieties, frustrations, how that impacts our nervous system and our ability to regulate?
Absolutely. So the two things that you said that are in my Instagram bio, I think are really interrelated or interconnected. So you said that, and I'm trying to think my own stuff. I help people reach and heal, and I help you befriend your nervous system. And so those things are really connected. So the reach and heal really refers to how important attachment is in our life. And attachment essentially is a bond, or as it refers to childhood, the bond between the child and the caregiver. And though this is not like set in stone, attachment is a mendable thing. It can change throughout our life and within different relationships. But that primary caregiver relationship really can set the stage for how our nervous system is wired. Now, essentially, we kind of were talking before that every one of us is wired for resilience and well-being. I mean, that's just who we are. However, those relationships that we have with our primary caregiver can really impact our wiring in that we might be wired more towards connection. So we learn from our caregiver that we learn who we are through their eyes, that we are good, we are safe, we deserve love. And then we also learn about relationships, that relationships can be safe, relationships can be dependable. Relationships will be responsive. And then we learn about the world. The world, it can be safe. So we learn those things through that attachment relationship when and then as a result, we experience that a wiring for connection, that we will go to others to get our needs met. And when we get those needs met, we can also be independent. So there's that two-way thing. The more connected we feel, the more we can go off and do our own thing. On the other hand, when those attachment relationships do not offer those primary needs to be met for safety, security, validation, and soothing, we end up having a nervous system that's more wired towards self-protection. And so this is where we can't necessarily trust ourselves, trust others, trust the world, and we're constantly grasping for something to help our nervous system achieve some kind of soothing. And most of the time, what happens is when we didn't have those needs met from our caregivers, we end up employing that shutdown response that you were talking about, that dorsal response. And that also leads us to shut off parts of ourselves, shuts off parts of ourselves that are otherwise wired to connect. And so it sort of leaves us in this place of, fragmentation or maybe even dissociation at sometimes. And yet the problem with this is that the natural wiring for connection remains deep down. And so there's this like paradox on the inside. We feel safer when we're alone because that's how we were wired. And yet there's this pull on the inside for something more. Am I making any sense? I'm like going crazy with it. But that's how I see how those two things, the attachment and the nervous system, come into play. And you can maybe see where I'm going with how this might affect people and their relationship with their body and their relationship with potentially with food. Because as children, we don't necessarily, as really young children, we might not use things as food yet to help ourselves soothe. We're just employing that dorsal response. But later on, we might learn that food does help us with some nervous system regulation. And then over time, it can become problematic. But here's the thing, we're doing the best we can. And it actually does work in some way. It does help us soothe a little bit. It's just more of a temporary thing.
Mm-hmm. So when you say like get our needs met, we rely on our primary caregiver to get our needs met. Like we're talking back in childhood, like our parents or our caregiver way when we were young. And when I meet with clients, we go there too, and we think about the first time that we, were recommended by, a doctor, to go on a diet, or our parents to go on a diet, or peers in school, even the parents of peers suggesting. I mean, I've heard a lot of different ways in which we have that first encounter with diet culture. And like I said, from a caregiver or from our peers, wherever we have that first encounter, and maybe if you're listening to this, you can reflect on that moment in your life too. The moment that you looked at your body maybe differently, where you felt like you weren't accepted, or that something needed to change to have that element of acceptance. Is there a correlation between like a need being met and this need for acceptance too? Because I feel like that's a theme when we first culture.
Oh, sure. I mean, you're talking, the need for acceptance is validation. I want to be seen. And when I'm seen through your eyes, I want to know that I'm okay. And so you're talking, what it sounds like you're talking about is this clash of where diet culture kind of collides with what we experienced growing up. And unfortunately, what diet culture has done to us is it's created these really skewed ideas of how we're supposed to be, right? I mean, typically we want our mother to look at us and say, "You are so good, just how you are." But the diet culture says different, and if their ideas have been molded by that, that's not the message that a mother is going to give to their child, and it's very unfortunate. And so that in itself creates such a conflict on the inside for the child, because more than likely, that's probably a question of, I didn't know that, but yet here's my mom telling me that, no, your body's not okay as it is. It needs to be smaller. And that creates that in itself can create like a sense of fragment on the inside, because it's really overwhelming. When something's overwhelming, too overwhelming, we tend to kind of cut off from it because we just can't process it.
Mm. Yeah, I've talked about that too on the show, how, my poor relationship with food really mostly impacted my relationship with my mother, and I think many people can relate
Mm.
to that too. How do we heal from that?
Oh, yeah.
Is that another,
Well,
like can of worms?
no. No, it's so good because I don't want it to sound like it's over, like it's like so much and it's unachievable or whatnot, but
Right.
it's definitely not like a, oh, let's check this box kind of thing, because everybody is different,
Yeah.
right? Everybody's trauma is different. Everybody's attachment is different. Like when we think about these childhood experiences, one might have abuse, one might have neglect, one might have experiences of severe misattunement, which just means maybe a parent told them over and over, like, you are not upset. No, stop. You're not upset. Or you're not supposed to have feelings, kind of thing. So
Mm,
that's misattunement. A child is trying to attune to look at their parent and say, like, see me and I'm upset and help me understand what that means. And there's none of that. And so that really can be taken in by the nervous system as traumatic. But each one of those experiences can show up differently for different people and then require, different ways of healing. But ultimately, I think the baseline of what healing would look like would be finding secure attachment, and that could be in a therapy room, that could be with your registered dietitian, that could be with a friend, yeah, that could be, with any relationship that's going to offer you an experience of safety and security and soothing and validation. And within that relationship, you can experience it, corrective experiences. So in other words, for that child that maybe was told, you don't feel that way, in a securely attached relationship, they can experience a person to look at them and say, you do feel that. That is what you feel right now. You feel upset. So that would be a corrective experience. Like, oof, that gives me chills thinking about how much healing that could do for a person. So
yes.
there's finding secure attachment relationships, finding new regulating resources for the nervous system outside of food. We don't have to take the food away if that's something that helps you soothe, but we want to find other options. Let's look at other options or ways that your nervous system might experience soothing and regulation. That's probably a great way to go on a healing journey. And then, of course, really big in my practice, I use some trauma focused treatments like EMDR to help us really go into the places that maybe we even have trouble remembering, but that clearly are feeding these current symptoms that we're having. And that otherwise, with these other options of trying to help our nervous system heal and or find secure attachment, that we're just having a hard time increasing our window of tolerance, and we might have to do some other kind of work like EMDR or some of these other what I call bottom up brain approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of the ways that we can maybe cope differently. Is that what I'm hearing? Like, we could use food to cope, and to soothe, but there are also other things that we can do and adding more tools in the arsenal instead. Or is this not an exact parallel with like ways we can cope and ways we can soothe?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, because again, we have to remember that if we have used food, if that's become something that we've relied on to help us find regulation and soothing, if we take that away so abruptly, that's not going to work. In fact, you're probably going to notice the system. And when I say the system, I mean the person, and all of the parts maybe that are inside the person are going to have a heyday trying to get that back. And people have probably experienced it. I know I did. And so
Absolutely.
we want to, the point of any kind of recovery or healing is gentle.
Yeah.
Like that's what we want to think is gentle and tolerable, We
Yeah.
want to be able to tolerate the steps that we want to make going forth, because we don't want to scare ourselves.
Absolutely. And as we're kind of getting into this like emotional eating-ish conversation, like that food meets a need in some way. I mean, we were talking about our ability to meet our own needs, or our ability or inability of having our needs met prior. So sometimes we can turn to food even later in life to
Sure.
try to meet a need that maybe isn't meeting like that deeper need. You were talking about like our initial wiring and then the wiring on top of the wiring. How can we relate that conversation to our initial wiring and our body wiring that's kind of influenced by diet culture, or ways that we think we should eat or should look or should exercise?
Well, it makes me think that, and I hope I'm going in the right direction. If I'm not, just stop me. But it makes me think of that there are these parts of us that align with diet culture, because that's probably what's fueling some of the things that we do. They think that it's important to do that. They think that it's so important to try to achieve the smaller body size, or only eat this certain thing, or restrict in this way, and this food isn't good. And those parts of us genuinely believe that this is what we're supposed to do. And yet, from if we were to like step into our self, and this sophisticated part of our brain, knows, oh, that's not good for us. Like that's not what we want. That's not how we want to show up in the world. And yet sometimes those parts that are more aligned with the next best thing or whatever kind of come forward and hijack us sometimes.
I was just listening to a intuitive eating workshop by the intuitive eating pros, Evelyn Tribili and Elise Resch. And they were talking about like there's this amygdala center of the brain that's like panic that hijacks the cortex and it like takes it over.
That's
Can
right.
that happen in a triggering instance where we feel like that initial need to lose weight fast, or the initial need to make a change to be healthier? Is that true?
I mean, I would say absolutely. And the way that you're talking about it sounds very like fight or flightish.
Yeah.
But sometimes I like to think of, and that probably is the case in some instances, but I feel like a lot of a lot of the clients that I've treated, and myself and my own experience, a lot of the eating disorder, or disordered eating behaviors, or these attempts to kind of do these things, are in a sort of dissociated space. So less of the fight or flight, more of that like kind of I'm detached from what I really want and who I really am, and this thing is taking over. So it's more of like a kind of like that dorsal experience, where it's more of like a dissociation, kind of a dissociate. Because a lot of folks will say, man, I didn't even realize I was doing that, or it kind of took me over. Well, that's a statement right there that says, wow, it sounds like you weren't really self-led in that moment. Something else was taking over you. So that tells me that like you weren't fully there, right?
Right. And that some things are happening almost to us because it's on autopilot or subconscious almost.
That's right. That's right. And autopilot is another just term for dissociation. Dissociation isn't a bad word. Dissociation is something that's on a continuum. I mean, tell me the last time that you probably drove from point A to point B and were like, oh my gosh, I'm driving. Like that's a space of dissociation. It wouldn't be healthy for our brains to remain completely focused all day, every single day. I mean, it's just part of what our brains do, is just it detaches that way sometimes. But it's on a continuum, and that's where I think a lot of these behaviors that come forth for people come from this more detached space. They're not in the forefront. They're not leading the show. They're in the back, and these other things are kind of in the front, taking over for them.
Yeah. So in this container that you're talking about, when we feel seen and validated in our experience and able to soothe in ways that feel supportive, and we're able to operate within our window of tolerance, how does it affect the ways that maybe we can bring consciousness to these situations where we were maybe on autopilot before? Or how does that like allow us to maybe respond more than react as we work on regulating the nervous system.
Yeah. Are you saying when we achieve this space of like secure attachment and we're looking at these instances where we might have, reverted back potentially, or?
Yeah, kind of coming out of that dorsal response and back into the window of tolerance. How does that affect how we live?
Well, I mean, I think that's just part of our humanness. I mean, I relate to that personally in my recovery journey because I kind of got to this place where I did spend more time in that what's called your ventral vagal state, which is, so you're talking about sympathetic, which if you look at a ladder, this is just polyvagal theory. The top of the ladder is your open space of ventral energy. You're curious, you're connected, you're calm. Ultimately, we want to be here as much as possible. But when we have things like disordered eating or eating disorders, or, we get hijacked by some things, we're not here a lot of the time. We're more in our sympathetic energy, which is one step down, or we're in that dorsal shutdown, which is the bottom level. And so throughout my journey, I learned to be in ventral more often. I was spending most of my time at the bottom of my ladder, but I learned to be in ventral more often. But that doesn't mean that I didn't take a few steps down the ladder every once in a while, because that's humanness. But what I found is that through recovery, I was able to climb back up the ladder much quicker than before. And that's just what, I think that's just what a picture of recovery looks like. You're never not going to be triggered. You're never not going to be, knocked out of that open, safe space. I mean, shoot, I was driving home and a cop with light went behind me and I immediately went into sympathetic. It wasn't me. They flew by me, but that's a normal, this is a normal nervous system response. I mean, this is just part of how we show up in the world. But when we get down, ultimately, the best case scenario is that we have regulating resources to bring us back up. Quicker than possible, and that we can stay there a little bit longer.
So yeah, when we climb down that ladder and we feel ourselves kind of reacting more than responding, we can get really down on ourselves. We can beat ourselves up and say, you know what? I'm so mad that I did that. I'm so mad that I used food to cope with my emotions. I'm so mad that I went on another diet. I knew that it wasn't going to work. I knew I shouldn't have spent the money. I knew I shouldn't have spent the time. And we kind of get into that kind of rut,
Yes.
Instead of thinking it's the experience. What do you think about that?
But do you know that all of that you just did, which I've done too, and everybody does, but all of that you just did came from right here, which is your sophisticated adult part of your brain. And guess what? This is not what's causing those knee-jerk reactions. It's this back here, your primitive part of your brain. This had nothing to do with it. And yet later on, this comes in and starts judging you for all the ways that your nervous system, without this part's permission, came to the rescue and did these things like grabbed this food or had this panic attack or went into isolation or froze up on the inside. All of those things are done outside of your conscious awareness. They're nervous system responses. And so we have to, a beautiful step towards, recovery is learning that these responses are not, they don't come from here. You don't wake up and say, oh, I'm going to have a panic attack today, or, oh, I'm going to, fail this goal today. That's not what happens. So it's really important for us to realize that it makes sense that we want to judge ourselves for doing those things, but those things are done from that primitive part of the brain, and they're done out of survival. They're trying to survive a moment to keep us safe, and that is their primary goal. I hope that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I think that's so comforting to hear that we're not making these decisions because we in the moment have thought them through. We're super logical. I love the word sophisticated because that's like we want to be sophisticated, right? We want to be so thoughtful. We want to, tidy this all up and then take aligned action, as I say, action that aligns with how
Yes.
we really want to show up. But in those instances where it is more of that knee-jerk impulsive reaction, to know that it's from the survival part of the brain, it's really reassuring for people.
Right. But I've had some people say, well, Melissa, that sounds so discouraging. So you're just going to tell me that I'm going to fly off the handle and knee jerk everywhere all the time? Like, no, not necessarily. But it's when we begin to get curious and to notice and get curious about how our nervous system responds that we begin to put a margin between those reactions and those responses. And then we begin to have just a little bit more awareness. And this is where we start to make those changes that we want to make. And we can show up in the world in a way that more aligns with our values. But, we do that by seeing if there's any possible way that we can pause the judgment in order to get curious and begin to, and that's why, my Instagram bio, befriend the nervous system.
We got to get along with our nervous system. We got to be together.
Yes, because it really, really, really just wants to help you. That's all that it does. This is what assigns moral judgment to how it shows up, but it doesn't assign moral judgment to how it shows up. It's just doing the very best that it can.
Mm-hmm. And for those listening, she's pointing to like that front part of her forehead, like the cortex of her brain, which I think is up here. And then she's pointing to the primitive part of the brain where it's like impulsive back.
Yes, thank you.
Behind your ears in the where the nape of your neck meets your
Yes. I forgot that this is going to be like a podcast too.
Yes. So something that I do in my practice that I feel is so impactful is role play. And I think it's because we're able to access that part of our brain that's like, oh, we can go back and not quite relive, but almost look into the situation differently. And it's maybe because we're accessing that part of our brain that's like, oh, and that's why that trigger caused me to do this thing. And of course I did that thing because it was the best thing that my body knew to do in that moment.
That is beautiful. Yes, that is what I would call some kind of experiential treatment. You are bringing alive all of the elements of an experience in this current moment. I love that. I think that's wonderful that you're incorporating that into your practice. I love it.
Is that something that the listeners could do on their own a bit if they're struggling in any way with food and body stuff? Could they maybe
in terms of like enacting something or
journaling or reflecting on their past experiences instead of feeling like, gosh, why did I do that thing? I'm so upset at myself. Would there be a space if we could, as you said, remove some of that judgment and kind of enter into an experience where we're reflecting on a past experience in a supportive way? In that way,
I think it all, like all of psychology, the answer is it depends. I mean, it really depends on the person, because like going back and opening up an experience and all the components of an experience, like the feelings, the beliefs, the images, the body sensations, sounds wonderful. However, that could be extremely triggering for some people. So it really depends on their state of regulation in the moment and their window of tolerance. How much can they tolerate with that? So it really depends. But one thing that I really think that could be really helpful is on the journey to beginning to become more aware of their nervous system is to kind of look at that ladder that I had talked about and the different states of our nervous system and the different activated states, which would be the sympathetic, the fight flight, and the dorsal, which is the bottom, which is the state of depression and detachment and sometimes dissociation and immobilization, and maybe begin journaling on what those look like for them. And then that top of the ladder is that ventral space. Remember, that open, connected, maybe journaling a little bit about, what is that like for them? Like for me, ventral is walking my dog and smelling the air and listening to his little footsteps, because he's like this tiny little Chihuahua miniature pincher and his feet go like 50 miles an hour. Listening to his little footsteps. It could be ventral is me squeezing my daughter's hand. Ventral is me, having some nice warm fuzzy socks. Journaling about that, about each of the experiences. And then same thing for the sympathetic. What does fight flight look like for you? And as long as you don't slip into the felt sense of those things. For example, if I'm journaling on fight flight and I start to think about fight flight is when my husband starts fussing at me about something and I start to experience this anger inside, and then I start to feel it, that's probably an indication that that might be too much of an activity for me. But if I can journal on something like this and kind of keep it at an arm's length with a little bit of distance from it, then that might be a really great exercise for me to learn my nervous system responses.
Absolutely. I think it's so wise to think about having someone guide you through this too, that container, that space that you hold for people. It's truly amazing to help them kind of download and process this rather than doing it on their own. I think that's just like the power of healing that having people to help us heal, I think is so important. And also if we are able to, journal, as you were saying, or kind of get into maybe a state where we can understand ourselves more through the journaling process, that can be really supportive as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. This question that I have for you is, I talk a lot in my practice in regards to being an embodied or a disembodied state often, and we talk about embodiment, embodying the principles of intuitive eating mostly, so it's not autopilot, but it becomes so much a part of our everyday in the way that we think and live. Nourishment becomes a part of just who we are in a way that really supports us physically, mentally, and emotionally, and otherwise. Like that's like the goal of intuitive eating is to really feel like we're,
Sounds so good.
A lot of the time it's like, bubble bath kind of feelings. And like you said, of course, we're also disembodied a lot of the time, but it's the thought of being in an embodied state. Is this something that reflects kind of this conversation of getting our needs met, feeling like we can find self-validation, finding ways to soothe? Does that run in parallel with this conversation of embodiment or being in our bodies rather than in our minds?
Absolutely. Definitely. And then while you were talking, I was also thinking like, for some people, being in their body is not safe. Some people have learned that. And so we have to kind of think about that. There's so many things, right, that we have to think about when we're talking about these things, because there's so much nuance and there's just a lot of components. But yes, this concept of embodiment is huge when it comes to this, because essentially, as I've talked this whole time, I think I've really highlighted this idea of detachment and fragmentation, and how, the system, when under stress, learns to kind of cut off parts of itself. And what you're talking about, this concept of intuitive eating is embodiment. And that's ultimately where we want to be. We want to become whole. We want to assimilate the parts again that we weren't allowed to feel, or weren't allowed to think, or it wasn't safe enough to do so. We want to assimilate those things again. And so I think that goes beautifully with this.
We're all broken, aren't we, Melissa?
Yeah. Broken and beautiful. Broken and beautiful.
Broken and beautiful, on the quest for wholeness, embodiment, and as you said, connection and well-being.
Yes. And yet embodiment isn't like embodiment. When I think of it, it's not perfection. It's, it's this process of ebb and flow, but there's also just this idea of the whole that's there. And even if sometimes the whole, has parts that aren't doing very well, but they're still all there together.
That's exactly it. And having an awareness of all of it happening too as a goal as well. Um, I think everyone listening, like myself, has just had their mind blown and they're having to re-put it together. And they've just gleaned so much from you and from the show. And so thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you shared. Can you share with everyone, like, how they might connect with you? I've dropped your Instagram handle, but can you share it again? And
Yeah,
ways that
I
they
am.
connect.
I'm on, thank you. Yes, I'm on Instagram and I'm over there making a fool of myself on TikTok.
Yeah, no, they're great.
Yeah, but both of those handles are Melissa Park Says. And then, and also on Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well. And so I'll definitely be having some things coming down what do they say, coming down the pike or coming down the pipeline in the future, in terms of ways that people can work with me outside of the therapy room. Because of course, within therapy, I can only treat clients that are within my state due to licensure regulations. But I'm opening up for those that don't need the whatever therapy provides, the structure that therapy provides. I'll be opening some opportunities for people to work with me within like a coaching capacity via courses or one-on-one coaching. And that should probably be hopefully by maybe summertime. So just keep an eye. I have a list that you can sign up for on Instagram, but I appreciate you highlighting me and bringing me on. It was so much fun. I hope that everything, and if anyone has any questions, of course, feel free to reach out and ask any questions if there was things that were unclear.
Are you meaning to say you have a wait list for working with you in the summertime? A list, you said?
No, like I have did I say a wait list?
Or
I'm going to be creating some courses and potentially coaching opportunities for people I'm hoping to get that launched by the summertime. But yeah, I have not a wait list. I have a email list.
an email list. Perfect.
Email list.
Sign up for the email list, follow Melissa so you can jump on her programs coming out later this year. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, and if you want a laugh while learning something about yourself and about therapy, follow Melissa's hilarious, absolutely hilarious, and also informative. So thank you so much, Melissa, for being here. We hope to have
you. Thank you.
Soon. And for everyone listening, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget, subscribe to the show, rate it, and also have just a great, great day. And we will see you on Monday's episode. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you.